Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite a stack of sources here today, taking a really close look at something incredibly fundamental to being human: belief.
Yeah, we're really diving into this idea of a science of human religion and ideologies. It's maybe more of an aspiration,
Yeah.
approaching belief systems with a kind of rigorous evidence-based lens.
Like you'd study a natural phenomena.
Exactly, but drawing from everywhere: sociology, psychology, history, you name it.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because a core idea, I think, running through these sources is the surprising role that artificial intelligence might play in building this science.
Right. AI, as it is now, doesn't really hold beliefs like we do. And that different perspective offers a potentially unique way to analyze belief itself.
Okay, so the mission for this deep dive, then, is to really unpack what this science of belief actually looks like. We want to explore its roots, deep in our minds and history, figure out why we humans often seem to, bounce off pure logic when it comes to our beliefs.
Yeah, why logic isn't always enough.
And see exactly how AI fits into this picture, and I guess ultimately understand what this science is actually for how it can help us navigate these, incredibly powerful forces of belief in the world today.
It's a journey through why we think what we think, basically.
Let's dive in. So what exactly is this science of belief that your sources are talking about? It sounds, frankly, huge.
Oh, it absolutely is. And it's not like physics, right? No neat universal laws.
Yeah.
But it's the goal, the aspiration of applying rigorous interdisciplinary study.
It's going from all over.
Yeah, pulling from sociology folks like Durkheim, Weber, Marx, looking at how beliefs function in groups, not really getting into whether they're true.
Kind of a methodological atheism, is that the term?
That's the idea. Plus psychology, cognitive and evolutionary, neurobiology, history, philosophy, and increasingly computational methods, AI.
So trying to understand belief from, every possible angle.
Exactly. And the big challenge, the sources point out, is how do you study something so deeply personal, so varied, from ancient myths to modern political movements.
Right. How do these things that surpass the limits of our knowledge, how do they somehow organize into shared systems, these moral communities?
That transition, from the intangible idea to the structured group, that's key.
And this is where AI comes in, offering that unique lens you mentioned.
Well, think about it. An AI, currently anyway, doesn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. It doesn't have its own faith or ideology.
So it can just analyze the data.
It can sift through just vast amounts of human data, texts, behaviors, historical patterns, looking for patterns, without that inherent human filter of, having beliefs ourselves.
It might spot things we miss because we're inside the system.
Potentially, yeah. Insights that are maybe harder for human researchers to see because we're always inevitably embedded in some belief system.
It's like getting an outside perspective on something you're totally immersed in.
Precisely. And your sources highlight this fascinating meta layer. We humans are developing a tool, AI, that could potentially model belief itself. And we're using that very tool to study human belief. It creates this kind of feedback loop. It deepens our understanding of both ourselves and the tool we're building.
That's quite a thought. Okay, so let's rewind a bit. Why are we, wired to believe in the first place?
Yeah.
What are the deep roots?
Well, it seems to be multi-layered. Starting right down at our basic cognitive architecture, belief is, essentially, our brain accepting something as true or actual. It's like the mental scaffolding we use to understand the world and figure out how to act in it.
And a lot of this is unconscious.
Oh, yeah. Much of it happens below the surface. And the sources really emphasize humans aren't perfectly rational machines. Not at all. Our minds use mental shortcuts, heuristics they're called, and we're prone to biases.
Which explains why some ideas stick, even without proof.
Exactly. It's a huge part of why non-empirical ideas, myths, ideologies, you name it, can be so incredibly powerful and, sticky.
So it's not just about processing facts, it's how our brains make sense of things quickly. Maybe efficiently.
Yes. And interestingly, from an AI perspective, when you try to model belief computationally, like in natural language processing, you have to break it down, right?
Into steps.
Kind of.
Yeah.
How is information acquired? Is it checked for consistency or maybe not? How confident is the system in that belief? How does it get integrated with everything else? Looking at it that way gives us potential clues about the computational steps happening inside our own heads.
Fascinating. What about evolution? Did belief actually give us some kind of survival advantage way back when?
Ah, yes. There's a whole field on this, the evolutionary psychology of religion, or EPR. The core idea is that a propensity for religious behavior, or maybe just belief-oriented behavior, likely evolved pretty early in human history.
But why? Was it a direct adaptation?
Well, that's the debate. Was it an adaptation, meaning it was directly selected for because it helped us survive and reproduce? Or was it a byproduct, maybe a side effect of other traits that were adaptive?
Okay, adaptation first. What would be the advantage?
The main argument there is social solidarity, cooperation, cohesion within groups. Belief systems, particularly religious ones, seem to be really good at fostering that.
The group benefit.
Right. Your sources mention Richard Sosis's work on 19th century utopian communes. He found that the religious ones, the ones with really costly rituals, the things that were hard to fake, tended to last longer than the secular ones.
Costly signaling.
Yeah.
Showing you're really committed.
That's the theory. It builds trust, deters free riders, makes the group stronger overall.
Okay, so what about the byproduct idea? Like an accidental side effect?
Exactly. Sometimes called a spandrel, borrowing from architecture a feature that arises as a consequence of other structural necessities, not for its own sake.
So what kind of side effect are we talking about?
Well, one key idea is something called the Hyperactive Agency Detection Device, HADD. It's our tendency, maybe evolved for predator avoidance, to see intentional agents like minds or wills everywhere, even where they don't exist.
Like seeing a face in the clouds, or thinking the wind sounds angry.
Precisely. Better safe than, evolutionarily speaking, right. Assume that Russell in the bushes is a predator. Another idea comes from Pascal Boyer. Minimally counterintuitive concept.
Minimally counterintuitive.
Yeah, ideas that are just slightly weird. They violate our everyday expectations just enough to be really memorable and easy to transmit. Think talking snakes, invisible beings, that sort of thing.
So maybe we're just wired to see agents everywhere and spread memorable, slightly strange stories.
That's part of the thinking. And, your sources suggest it's likely not just one or the other. It could easily be coevolution.
How so?
Well, maybe these early cognitive byproducts like HADD provide the sort of mental raw material for supernatural thinking. Then cultural evolution steps in. If cultural systems built on that material happen to boost group survival, maybe by fostering cooperation, then those specific belief systems get favored over time.
So it's a complex dance between our brain wiring and the cultural ideas that spread.
A very complex dance, yes, between our innate predispositions and the cultural software we run.
Okay, so beyond the individual brain, how does belief function out there in society?
Right, that brings us to sociology. Emil Durkheim, for instance, saw belief, especially religion, as fundamentally about community.
It binds people together.
Exactly. He called it a unified system relative to sacred things that unite into one single moral community. It's social glue. It fosters cohesion, reinforces shared norms and values, provides meaning, comfort, especially in tough times.
So celebrating sacred things is like celebrating the group itself.
That was his argument, yeah. Celebrating the collective power of society.
Now, Karl Marx had a very different take, didn't he?
Oh, pulls apart. For Marx, belief, or ideology as he often termed it, was primarily a tool used by dominant groups to maintain power and control. By masking the truth, he argued. Justifying inequality, keeping people from seeing the real economic and power dynamics at play. It helps reproduce systems like capitalism by making the existing social order seem natural or maybe even divinely ordained.
So one sees it as binding us together, the other as blinding us to reality.
Pretty much sums up the contrast. And then you have Max Weber, who offered a more nuanced view. He looked at the interplay how religious ideas could actually influence socioeconomic structures. His famous example is the link he saw between certain Protestant ethics and the rise of capitalism.
So these sociological views show beliefs aren't just in our heads.
Definitely not. They're deeply woven into social structures, power dynamics, how societies organize themselves.
We've touched on cognitive roots, evolutionary roots. Is there anything actually in our biology or genetics that predisposes us to belief?
Well, there are some intriguing hints, though it's definitely complex and debated territory. There was some research, for example, pointing to a potential link between a specific gene, VMAT2, I think, and a predisposition towards spiritual or mystical experiences, possibly by influencing certain brain chemicals, monominds.
A God gene? Wasn't that controversial?
Highly controversial, yes, and certainly not definitive. But then you also have twin studies suggesting that the tendency for what's called self-transcendence, having feelings of spirituality, awe, connection to something larger, might be partially heritable, maybe around 40% or so.
Okay, hang on. A predisposition for the feeling or the experience, but not for specific beliefs, like which god to worship.
That's a crucial distinction, absolutely crucial. The science, as it stands, points towards a potential biological capacity or maybe an inclination for spiritual experience or the search for meaning.
But the content comes from culture.
Overwhelmingly, yes. The actual content of what you believe, which specific deities, which rituals, which doctrines, which political ideology that's transmitted culturally. Through learning, through social interaction, like cultural memes, as Richard Dawkins termed them.
So nature might give us the hardware, the possibility, but culture provides the software, the specifics.
That's a really good way to put it. The biological element might create the fertile ground, the capacity for seeking or experiencing transcendence. And then culture plants the specific seeds, the myths, the rituals, the ideologies that give it form and content.
Which would explain why the inclination seems universal, but the beliefs themselves are so incredibly diverse.
Exactly. It helps make sense of that pattern. If AI were modeling this, you could imagine setting up a system with agents having certain built-in parameters, like these predispositions, interacting within a social network that transmits cultural data, and then just seeing what kinds of belief patterns emerge over time.
Fascinating simulation idea. Okay, so we've covered these deep roots, our minds, evolution, society, maybe even some biology. Now, let's pivot to the impact. Your sources call belief a double-edged sword.
And it absolutely is. It comes through loud and clear. Belief systems have this immense power, right? They're capable of inspiring incredible connection, altruism, good, but also undeniably enormous harm.
Let's start with the positive edge. Cohesion, community.
Yeah, that's the Durkheimian view again, but it holds up. Shared beliefs and practices really do create those moral communities. They provide that vital social cement, identity, comfort, shared purpose.
And the evolutionary angle supports that too.
It does. Stronger, more cooperative groups likely had survival advantages. And even secular ideologies can unite people behind shared goals, sometimes for immense collective achievement, sometimes, well, not.
Okay, now the other edge. Conflict and harm.
This is the flip side. The very same mechanisms that create strong in-groups, often almost inevitably, it seems, create stark divisions without groups.
Beliefs causing conflict.
Well, the sources are nuanced. They might not always be the sole or primary cause of conflict. One source mentioned data suggesting religion might be the main driver in a smaller percentage of historical wars than commonly assumed, maybe around 7%.
But they're powerful tools to justify conflict.
Incredibly powerful tools for legitimizing or exacerbating conflict. Absolutely.
And history, unfortunately, provides plenty of grim examples.
Oh, absolutely. The Crusades, the European wars of religion. Moving into the modern era, the Cold War was fundamentally an ideological conflict. These are stark reminders of that destructive potential.
What's happening psychologically there? In-groups versus out-groups.
That's key. In-group, out-group theory. We naturally categorize people. We tend to favor our own group, view it positively, see its diversity. And we often view out-groups with suspicion, sometimes stereotyping them negatively, seeing them as more homogenous than they really are.
Which can lead to?
Suspicion, opposition, hatred, and in the extreme, dehumanization.
Dehumanization. That sounds particularly dangerous.
It's a terrifying psychological mechanism. Perceiving an outgroup as less than human, as fundamentally different and inferior, it drastically lowers the moral barriers to violence.
It makes atrocities possible.
It correlates strongly with support for violence and atrocities, yes. It strips away the moral hesitation we'd normally feel. And your sources note how belief systems can provide the very framework to justify this.
How so?
Through narratives like divine mandates to cleanse the world or usher in a new order, perhaps violently, or ideologies that construct think of colonial constructions of the Orient, your sources mentioned, as inherently backward or dangerous, not fully human in the same way we are. Specific examples cited range from nationalist violence to extremist religious groups.
So the very thing that binds us together so tightly can also be twisted to justify tearing others down.
Exactly. It's that double-edged nature. The same deeply held sacred values that create intense in-group loyalty and cohesion can be weaponized against any group perceived as a threat to those values or that identity.
So belief isn't inherently good or bad, but depends on the context.
Very much so. It depends on the content of the beliefs, the narratives surrounding them, and the intergroup dynamics at play. Mitigating the harm often comes down to managing those intergroup relations, fostering more inclusive identities, challenging dehumanizing narratives.
And you mentioned earlier the lack of total knowledge. How does our struggle with uncertainty make us vulnerable to harmful beliefs.
Right. When the world feels uncertain, complex, maybe frightening, belief systems can offer comprehensive, often simple answers. They fill in the gaps where empirical evidence is scarce or ambiguous. They provide a sense of order, control, reduce anxiety.
And once we adopt them,
Especially if they meet those deep psychological needs for meaning, belonging, or security, they become incredibly resistant to change. They get protected by cognitive biases like confirmation bias. We seek out information that confirms what we already believe and ignore or dismiss what doesn't.
so just throwing facts at someone often doesn't work.
Often not, because the belief isn't just held for its factual accuracy, assuming it even claims any. It's serving a deeper psychological or social function. You have to address that function often.
Does the impact of belief, this double-edged sword, vary depending on who you are, where you are, when you are?
Definitely. Your sources point this out clearly. Across demographics, think about gender, for instance, how ideologies, often rooted in religious interpretations, have shaped gender roles, power dynamics, sometimes justifying harmful practices.
And age.
Age is huge. The transmission across generations. Schopenhauer's point about early indoctrination creating lifelong resistance to doubt. Culture, obviously you see belief structures everywhere, but the concept of religion itself is arguably a Western construct, and ideologies are deeply interwoven with cultural norms.
And history shows shifts too.
Big shifts, like the move post-17th century Europe maybe, from predominantly religious explanations for conflict towards more secular ideological ones. Think of the huge ideological struggles of the 20th century.
And beliefs influence pretty much every domain of life. Laws, philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. They are architects of our norms, our values, our moral codes. They get reflected, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, in our laws. They drive philosophical inquiry. They shape how we organize society. They're fundamental drivers in history, catalysts for change, empires, social movements.
Could AI potentially help analyze these really complex impacts? Model them?
Potentially, yes. That's one of the hopes. By analyzing vast data sets, looking at rhetoric, economic conditions, social stability, conflict patterns, AI might help model potential tipping points.
Tipping points where cohesion turns hostile.
Exactly. Where a group's strong identity, fueled by belief, shifts towards violence or discrimination against an outgroup. Maybe identifying high-risk signatures like a combination of dehumanizing language, resource scarcity, and political instability.
Moving towards predictive analysis.
Potentially, yes. But that, of course, opens up a whole new Pandora's box of very complex ethical questions about profiling, intervention, and potential misuse.
Right. Huge ethical considerations there. Okay, so we've seen the power, the roots, the impacts. How do belief systems interact with philosophy, logic, science? It often feels like there's, well, tension.
There often is, yes, though not always. Philosophy, of course, has grappled with belief for millennia. Philosophy of religion asks the big questions. Does God exist? What is faith? How do reason and revelation relate? The problem of evil.
And then there's critique.
Right. Ideology critique, particularly from thinkers like Marx, Gramsci, Althusser. That tradition focuses on analyzing how beliefs function not necessarily as truth claims, but as systems that embed power structures, legitimize inequality, make the status quo seem natural.
And more direct criticism of beliefs itself.
Oh yeah, that goes way back, at least to ancient Greece. Common criticisms, your sources note, are that specific beliefs are outdated, harmful, impede scientific progress, justify immoral acts, or are primarily used as political tools. David Hume, for example, famously argued religion arises more from human hope and fear comfort than from rational argument or honest engagement with truth.
Your sources also listed a bunch of logical fallacies. How do those connect?
Well, the rational critique of specific belief claims often involves identifying common flaws in reasoning logical fallacies that are used to defend those beliefs, especially when they lack strong empirical support.
Could you give some examples?
Sure. The sources mention things like the argument from incredulity. I can't imagine how that could be true, therefore it must be false. Or the appeal to ignorance, you can't disprove it, so it must be true, or vice versa. Begging the question where you assume the conclusion in your premise, like the Bible is true because it's the word of God and God's word is true.
Others.
Straw man arguments, misrepresenting your opponent's view to make it easier to attack. Ad hominem, attacking the person making the argument instead of the argument itself. Equivocation, using a word with multiple meanings misleadingly. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, assuming that because B happened after A must have caused B. Correlation is not causation, right? Argument from authority just because someone important says it doesn't make it true. the association fallacy, guilt by association, and things like the fine-tuning or watchmaker arguments, arguing that complexity implies a designer.
That's quite a list. Are people using these fallacies deliberately, like trying to trick others?
Sometimes, maybe. But your sources suggest it's often not deliberate. These fallacies frequently function, perhaps unconsciously, as protective mechanisms.
Protecting the belief.
Protecting core beliefs, yeah. Beliefs that are deeply tied to our identity, our community, our sense of meaning in the world. When these core beliefs are challenged, especially if they lack strong empirical backing, these faulty arguments can serve to deflect the challenge and keep the belief system intact and coherent, at least internally.
So pointing out the fallacy might not be enough?
Often not. An appeal to authority, for instance, might reinforce group identity and cohesion. Begging the question creates a kind of self-sealing logic that's hard to penetrate from the outside. The point the sources make is that effectively engaging with beliefs often is understanding and addressing the underlying needs they fulfill, not just winning a logical debate by pointing out fallacies.
That makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What about the natural sciences, physics, math, biology, the stuff that deals very directly with physical reality? What's the relationship between belief systems and that kind of knowledge?
Yeah.
Conflict, compatibility.
It's hotly debated, as you can imagine. You see different models. Some argue for inherent conflict. Science and religion are fundamentally incompatible. Maybe science replaces the need for religion. Others argue for compatibility or even interdependence. Maybe they address different questions. Or perhaps science reveals things that support religious views.
And there's NOMA.
Right, Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria. Science deals with the empirical realm, the what is, while religion deals with ultimate meaning, morality, the what ought to be. They have different domains, different tools.
Science uses methodological naturalism, right?
Yeah.
Looking for natural explanations within the observable universe.
Exactly. Science, by its method, doesn't typically invoke supernatural entities or forces to explain phenomena. Religion often deals precisely with the supernatural. That's a key difference.
So discoveries in physics, cosmology.
They always stimulate discussion. Some people interpret things like the Big Bang or the fine-tuning of cosmological constants as evidence for theological ideas. Others see them as purely natural phenomena or argue the domains are just incommensurable. They don't speak the same language. Yeah. And of course, many non-literal interpretations of religious texts avoid direct conflict with established scientific findings like evolution or the age of the universe.
What about the connection between mathematics and belief? That seems less obvious, maybe.
It's surprisingly deep, historically speaking. Your sources mention several influential mathematicians, think Pythagoras, Newton, Gödel, even Ramanujan, who held profound mystical or spiritual beliefs.
Ramanujan said equations expressed thoughts of God.
He did. An equation for me has no meaning unless it expresses a thought of God. There's also ancient number, mysticism, the significance of 7, odd numbers, things like that. Einstein himself said something like, thought and ideas, not formula, are the beginning. It raises fascinating questions. Is math just a useful tool, a human cognitive construct, or does it somehow tap into a deeper, maybe even Platonic reality?
What about people working in science and tech today? Does more science mean less belief?
The studies cited in your sources are actually pretty mixed. Some find scientists and engineers tend to be less religious than the general population. Others find mixed results or even positive correlations in some contexts. There's that old quote, something like, a little knowledge takes you away from God, but deeper knowledge brings you back to him.
So it's definitely not a simple story of science just replacing belief.
Not at all. Your sources suggest a much more intricate connection. Maybe. Just maybe, the very cognitive capacities that allow for high-level abstract thought in science and mathematics, things like theory of mind, complex causal inference, symbolism, grappling with unseen forces or abstract structures, maybe those are linked to the same cognitive tools that also enable religious thought or ideological commitment in the first place.
The mind capable of one is capable of the other.
It could be. The human mind capable of profound scientific discovery might, by its very nature, also be the mind capable of profound religious or ideological thought. The conflict or compatibility often seems to arise not from the underlying capacity, but from how we choose to apply those shared cognitive capacities in different domains and the conclusions we draw.
Okay, that's a really interesting perspective. We've explored this vast landscape. Now let's talk about something big the sources emphasize, the need for systemic thinking. And this related question of why humans seem to, well, stray from the kind of rational, evidence-based systemic analysis this science suggests.
Right. To really get a handle on belief, your sources argue you absolutely need systemic thinking. It's a crucial shift in perspective.
What does that mean exactly? Systemic thinking.
It's basically looking at the whole picture, seeing the relationships, the interconnectedness, the patterns, rather than just focusing on individual parts in isolation. It's like zooming out to see the forest, not just the individual trees.
So a system is more than the sum of its parts.
Exactly. A system has components, sure, but their interactions, their relationships, form this complex web. And that web creates emergent properties, things like group cohesion or conflict or resilience that you can't predict just by looking at the pieces separately. Systems are dynamic, they're influenced by feedback loops, and they often resist simple linear fixes.
It's the opposite of trying to find one single cause for everything.
Very much the opposite of linear thinking, yeah, which tends to isolate problems, focus on symptoms, maybe blame one part of the system. Systemic thinking looks for the underlying structures, the feedback loops, the interdependencies.
Okay, how does that apply specifically to belief systems?
Well, belief systems are classic, complex, adaptive systems. Think about the elements. Tenets, narratives, sacred texts, rituals, symbols, institutions, leaders, followers.
All interacting.
All interacting constantly. And those interactions generate the emergent properties we see: group identity, shared norms, social control, cooperation, but also schisms, radicalization, conflict. History itself can be seen as a series of massive shifts within and between these belief systems. Ideological conflicts are fundamentally systemic battles for hearts and minds.
And complex social problems like racism or poverty.
Your sources frame those as deeply entrenched systems, too. They persist not just because of individual attitudes or failings, but because of interconnected structures, economic, political, cultural, historical institutions, and power dynamics that reinforce each other.
And the system resists change.
Often, yes, especially because those who benefit from the existing system have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Power structures tend to be self-perpetuating.
And AI could help model these complex belief systems.
That's a key potential application mentioned. AI could potentially model beliefs as vast networks of ideas, agents, and connections. By analyzing how changes ripple through the system, maybe a leader reinterprets key text, or a new communication technology emerges like social media AI, could help us understand how belief systems evolve, fragment, polarize, or maybe even become more resilient. It lets us study their dynamic behavior in ways that were impossible before.
All right, so that brings us to the really big question the user raised. Why do humans deviate from the rules of this science? If the rules, so to speak, are about being rational, evidence-based, seeing the whole system, why do we so often act in ways that seem, well, illogical or counterproductive?
Yeah, your sources dive deep into this, and it's definitely not one simple answer. It's a combination of factors. First off, just our fundamental cognitive limitations and biases.
We're not perfect thinking machines.
Not even close. We rely on those mental shortcuts, heuristics, that can be efficient but also lead us astray. Our biases, confirmation bias, in-group bias, etc., systematically distort how we process information and make decisions. And that lack of total knowledge we keep coming back to makes us susceptible to simple, emotionally resonant explanations, even if they aren't strictly logical or evidence-based.
Our brains are maybe built more for survival and quick decisions than for pure objective logic.
There's definitely an element of that evolutionary heritage, yeah. Second big factor, emotions. Beliefs aren't just cold cognitions. They're deeply, profoundly intertwined with powerful emotions.
Fear, hope, love.
Fear, hope, love, loyalty, belonging, hate, anxiety, you name it. And strong emotions can easily override logical analysis. Beliefs fulfill fundamental human needs for comfort, for meaning, for identity, for a sense of control over an uncertain world. And because they serve these deep needs, they become incredibly resistant to being disproven by mere facts or logic.
So logic often takes a backseat to our feelings and fundamental needs.
Very often. And third, we have to consider the systemic pressures. We don't form or hold beliefs in a vacuum. We are embedded in social systems that exert powerful forces on us.
Like conformity, wanting to fit in.
Social conformity is huge, yes. We have a deep-seated desire to belong, to be accepted by our group. Adhering to the group's norms and beliefs, even if they seem irrational from the outside, is often key to that belonging. Deviating risks social exclusion, which is a powerful deterrent.
And the power structures you mentioned earlier play a role here too.
Absolutely critical. Dominant groups in society often use ideology systems of belief to maintain their control, to shape the norms, the institutions, the very way people think about the world.
Gramsci's hegemony.
Exactly. Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony describes how the worldview of the ruling class can become so pervasive that it's just seen as common sense, as natural and inevitable, not as one possible viewpoint among others.
So people act illogically because their reality is shaped by this dominant view.
Precisely. From an outside perspective, their actions might seem illogical or against their own best interests. But from within that hegemonic framework, they aren't breaking abstract rules of logic. They are acting according to the internalized rules of their lived reality, a reality defined and constrained by the dominant belief system. Challenging that is incredibly difficult, both cognitively and socially.
Wow. So it's not just a personal failure to be rational, but often about being shaped, sometimes unconsciously, by the powerful systems we live within.
That's a key insight from the systemic perspective, yes. Systems resist change. Addressing harmful beliefs or behaviors often requires addressing the underlying systemic patterns and power dynamics, not just telling individuals they are wrong or irrational.
So often when we deviate from this science's rules, it means we're failing to apply systemic thinking. We're falling back on simpler explanations.
That's a good way to frame it. We default to linear, reductionist explanations, blaming individual leaders for wars without seeing the complex interplay of factors, for example. A key purpose of developing this science of belief, your sources argue, is precisely to build systemic literacy, to help us grasp the bigger picture, the web of connections, making us hopefully less susceptible to simplistic, polarizing, and ultimately harmful judgments and actions.
That really reframes the whole issue. It's less about individual error and more about the complex forces acting on us. Okay, so what are the core principles this science is uncovering about how beliefs actually work? And what are the broader implications of understanding these principles?
Well, think of them less as prescriptive rules and more as descriptive principles, emergent understandings of how belief systems function and impact us. Your sources highlight several key ones.
Okay, like what?
Like intersubjectivity and social construction. The idea that beliefs are fundamentally shaped, validated, and transmitted through social interaction and culture. Our shared realities are, in a sense, co-constructed.
Makes sense. What else?
Functional utility. Beliefs persist, often stubbornly, because they meet real psychological and social needs, meaning identity, community, anxiety reduction, etc. Potential for harm. Especially when beliefs become absolutist, exclusionary, or dehumanizing, they carry a significant potential for prejudice, discrimination, conflict, and violence.
When our own thinking flaws.
Right. Cognitive bias. Our reasoning about beliefs, both our own and others, is systematically influenced by a host of cognitive biases. This explains why beliefs that aren't well supported by evidence can still form and be maintained. Systemic interconnectedness. Beliefs aren't isolated. They're integral parts of larger psychological, social, cultural, economic, and political systems. Changes in one part can ripple through the entire system.
And they're not set in stone.
Definitely not. Malleability and evolution. Belief systems aren't static. They evolve over time in response to changing conditions, new information, internal tensions, contact with other cultures. New interpretations arise, old tenets get discarded or reimagined.
How does understanding these principles help us evaluate the ethics of actions driven by belief, especially harmful ones?
That's a really important application. Your sources discuss applying major ethical frameworks like deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics to belief-motivated actions.
Can you briefly recap those?
Sure. Deontology focuses on rules and duties. An action is right if it conforms to a moral rule like do not kill regardless of consequences. Think Kant or divine commandments. Consequentialism, like utilitarianism, judges morality based on outcomes, the greatest good for the greatest number. And virtue ethics focuses on character. What would a virtuous person, honest, compassionate, wise, do in this situation?
And applying these reveals.
It often reveals just how deeply incommensurable different worldviews can be. Some of the implications are huge, really. Health, for example. Beliefs clearly impact health outcomes. Both positively think social support from religious communities, stress reduction from meditation, and negatively refusing medical care based on beliefs, stress from discrimination or persecution.
And shaping society.
Absolutely. Beliefs are primary architects of our societal norms, values, and moral codes. They influence everything from family structures and gender roles to ideas about responsibility and justice. Laws, too many secular laws concerning things like murder or theft, have deep historical roots in religious codes. And modern political ideologies constantly inform the content of laws regarding property, rights, social welfare, and so on.
So this science argues for laws based on...
It generally advocates for laws and policies that are evidence-based, aiming to promote well-being, reduce harm, protect fundamental rights, while remaining mindful of the diversity of beliefs within society. And importantly, your sources stress that this science of belief itself operates within the known laws of nature, physics, biology, chemistry. It seeks naturalistic explanations, like cognitive evolution, for why humans believe. It doesn't posit supernatural interventions. It investigates belief as a natural characteristic of our species.
Okay, your sources mentioned a very specific user question about a proper rule for retirement from government. How does this science offer insights into something that concrete?
That's a fascinating application, yeah. Political science, of course, debates things like term limits or mandatory retirement ages for politicians. Arguments for include ensuring responsiveness, bringing in fresh perspectives, preventing entrenchment. Arguments against often focus on the loss of valuable experience and expertise, potential instability.
So how does the science of belief angle contribute?
It brings in insights about the effects of long-held power, ideology, and cognitive function over time. The principles suggest that holding power for extended periods can lead to over-identification with a specific ideology, decreased cognitive flexibility, less adaptability. Mental scaffolding can become rigid, reinforced by echo chambers and confirmation bias.
So the principles about beliefs becoming entrenched and resistant to change apply to political leaders too.
Exactly, which suggests that maybe a simple mandatory retirement age is too blunt an instrument. A more nuanced approach, informed by this science, might focus on principles rather than just age.
Principles like?
Unlike finding ways to ensure continued cognitive flexibility and openness to new evidence, maybe through periodic independent assessments, mandatory exposure to diverse viewpoints, or structured red teaming of policies. Strengthening mechanisms for evidence-based policymaking so decisions are driven more by rigorous analysis and less by pure ideology or tradition. Promoting transparency and accountability, and perhaps facilitating graceful transitions, allowing experienced leaders to move into advisory or mentorship roles.
So the goal isn't just removing older officials, but ensuring the whole system of governance remains dynamic, adaptive, and resilient against the potential negative effects of long-term ideological rigidity or cognitive decline.
That's the systemic perspective, yes. Focusing on the health and adaptability of the governance system, not just individual actors based on one factor like age.
That's a really interesting way to connect these broader principles to a very practical question. Okay, let's circle back more fully to artificial intelligence. Your sources position AI not just as a tool for this science, but as a new significant actor within the whole landscape of belief.
It absolutely is. It's becoming increasingly clear. AI is a powerful tool for analysis, yes. But it's also potentially an agent of persuasion, a technology for mitigating harm, and definitely a source of profound ethical questions and challenges.
Let's start with persuasion. Can an AI, which, as you said, doesn't have beliefs or emotions itself, actually convince a human to change their mind about deeply held ideas like religious faith or political ideology?
It's complex. Current AI crucially lacks genuine consciousness, subjective experience, emotion, human intentionality. And persuading someone to abandon beliefs that are deeply tied to their identity, their community, their sense of meaning, that usually requires things like emotional connection, trust, shared values, a deep understanding of human psychology. Things AI can only simulate, perhaps imperfectly.
So pure logic from a machine might not be enough.
Pure logic often isn't enough even from another human when dealing with these kinds of beliefs. AI can be built to present logical arguments very effectively. It can identify fallacies in human reasoning, highlight inconsistencies between someone's stated beliefs and available evidence. We see chatbots already showing some capacity for sophisticated dialogue that could potentially help people recognize their own biases.
But it can't provide the emotional connection or address the underlying need.
Not easily, not genuinely, not yet anyway. To really shift someone away from, say, a harmful ideology, an AI might need to not just debunk the ideology's claims, but somehow understand and address the underlying emotional, social, or existential needs that ideology was fulfilling for that person.
Like helping them find an alternative source of community or meaning or purpose.
Potentially, yes. But see, that moves AI from being conceived as a neutral information provider or logical reasoner into something much more active, a subtle shaper of values, potentially influencing behavior in profound ways. And that immediately raises huge ethical flags about manipulation, autonomy, and whose values are being promoted.
Right. What about using AI for good in this space? Using it to mitigate some of the negative aspects of belief systems or foster more constructive habits of mind.
There are definitely promising avenues being explored there. AI can be trained, for example, to detect patterns in language or behavior associated with harmful biases, prejudice, or radicalization. It could potentially help identify and flag misinformation, propaganda, or hate speech online much faster than humans can.
Tools for critical thinking.
Yes, AI could be used to develop educational tools that help people build critical thinking skills, improve media literacy, maybe even simulate different perspectives to try and foster empathy. Imagine AI tutors providing personalized feedback on logical reasoning, or tools that help users analyze news sources for bias.
But you mentioned the paradox earlier. AI can help teach critical thinking, but AI itself makes things like deep fakes and sophisticated misinformation easier to create than ever.
It's a massive paradox, a real double-edged sword. AI can be a tool against manipulation, but it's also the most powerful tool for manipulation we've ever created. It necessitates more human critical thinking, not less, precisely because the information environment is becoming so saturated with potentially AI-generated or AI-amplified content.
And empathetic AI. Can AI really be empathetic?
It can simulate empathy. It can be programmed to recognize emotional cues in text or voice and respond in ways that seem supportive or understanding. This is called cognitive empathy, understanding or predicting emotions. But it lacks genuine affective empathy, feeling the emotion. And users often detect that artificiality, which can limit trust and the potential for deep, meaningful connection or therapeutic benefit.
This leads us squarely into the big ethical challenges of AI interacting with human beliefs and emotions.
Profound challenges, yeah. Bias and discrimination are huge ones. If AI learns from biased human data, and most large data sets reflect historical biases, it can perpetuate or even amplify those biases. We see this potentially happening in content moderation, information dissemination, even AI mental health tools.
And the black box problem.
Right, opacity. The decision-making processes of complex AI models can be incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible for humans to fully understand. This makes it hard to detect hidden biases, hard to debug problems, and incredibly difficult to assign accountability when AI systems cause harm.
And the risk of manipulation.
A major concern. As AI gets better at understanding and simulating human language and emotion, the potential for it to be exploited for sophisticated commercial or political manipulation grows exponentially. That fine line between empathetic assistance and subtle, perhaps undetectable persuasion or coercion is very, very blurry.
And who's responsible when it goes wrong? If AI radicalizes someone or spreads harmful misinformation.
That question of responsibility and accountability is incredibly complex. Is it the developers? The company that deployed the AI, the user who interacted with it, society? There are no easy answers yet. Plus, you have major issues around data privacy, especially when AI is dealing with sensitive information about people's beliefs, emotions, and mental states.
And the risk of just relying on it too much.
Yes, autonomy and over-reliance. If we become too dependent on AI for information, guidance, or even emotional support, could it gradually erode our own critical thinking skills, our independent judgment, our human autonomy? It's a serious long-term concern.
So we need guiding principles.
Absolutely. Your sources mention principles like those proposed by companies like IBM. AI should augment human intelligence, not replace it. Data ownership should remain with the creator. AI systems must be transparent and explainable. Fundamentally, the development and deployment of AI in this sensitive area needs to be guided by a deep understanding of this very science of belief we've been discussing, to ensure it empowers humans rather than controlling or deceiving them.
It really sounds like AI isn't just a tool to study belief anymore, but it's become a new, powerful force that is now inextricably part of the belief landscape itself, bringing huge potential, but also huge risks.
That's an excellent way to summarize it, I think. It's both the microscope we're using and potentially a new, very active element on the slide we're observing.
Okay, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground here. Let's try to bring it together. What is the ultimate purpose, the point of this whole endeavor, this science of human religion and ideologies, bringing in AI, emphasizing systemic thinking? It's clearly not about trying to get everyone to stop believing things.
Absolutely not. That would be futile, misguided, and probably undesirable anyway. Belief is too fundamental. It fulfills too many vital human functions. The purpose, as your sources frame it, is really about illumination and mitigation.
Illumination and mitigation.
Yeah, to deeply illuminate the dynamics of belief, where it comes from, how it functions psychologically and socially, why it's so powerful and persistent, and then, based on that understanding, to find ways to mitigate its potential for harm, the conflict, the prejudice, the oppression, and perhaps even channel its powerful influence towards more constructive ends for individual and societal well-being.
So like fostering a more critical understanding in people, helping us see how belief works in ourselves and others.
Exactly. Equipping individuals and societies with the tools to understand how beliefs form, how they spread, how they shape our cognition, our behavior, our history. Identifying the warning signs of harmful ideologies by understanding their root causes, the cognitive biases they exploit, the psychological needs they prey on, the exclusionary narratives they employ.
And promoting empathy, reducing conflict.
Hopefully, yes. By revealing the shared human vulnerabilities, the cognitive commonalities that underlie our diverse beliefs, perhaps we can start to dismantle some of the othering that fuels so much conflict, fostering empathy and understanding between groups with different belief systems.
And using these insights to maybe build better societies, design things differently.
That's the constructive goal, yes. Informing how we approach education, teaching critical thinking, media literacy, ethics from an early age. Informing the design of social structures, media environments, public policies in ways that support critical thinking, ethical behavior, psychological well-being, and resilience against manipulation. Trying to design systems that respect the deep human need for meaning and belonging, but without fostering dogmatism or exclusion.
It sounds like striving towards that balanced universe concept the sources mentioned.
I think that's the aspiration. Not a universe with one single belief system, obviously, but a global environment where diverse human quests for meaning can coexist alongside scientific rationality, shared ethical principles, and mutual respect. It requires acknowledging the power of belief, understanding its origins and functions, and developing the wisdom and the tools to channel that power pro-socially away from its destructive paths.
Your sources used a metaphor. Debugging humanity's operating system.
Yeah, the socio-cognitive operating system. Harmful ideologies are seen as akin to bugs or malware that exploit vulnerabilities in our cognitive and social makeup. Things like fear, anxiety, in-group bias, conformity pressure, susceptibility to misinformation cascades. These bugs can cause systemic malfunctions like polarization, distrust, conflict.
So this science is like the diagnostic tool.
It's the diagnostic tool, yeah. And potentially helps us design the patches, things like better education, improved media literacy, facilitated intergroup dialogue, crafting alternative narratives that meet needs constructively. It moves beyond just passive academic understanding towards a more active, though ethically complex, engagement aimed at fostering healthier societies.
So based on this science, what are some concrete steps or improvements that might help build that better balance? What logical arguments did the sources suggest?
Okay, drawing from the material, several things come up repeatedly. One is comprehensive education, starting early, focused on critical thinking, logical reasoning, understanding cognitive biases and logical fallacies, media literacy, and the psychology of manipulation, really equipping people to navigate the modern information environment.
Makes sense. What else?
Promoting positive intergroup contact, based on understanding in-group, out-group dynamics, deliberately fostering structured interaction between different groups, especially when working towards shared, superordinate goals. This can help break down stereotypes, reduce prejudice, and build more inclusive identities, expanding the we.
And managing AI.
Absolutely crucial. Ethical and responsible development and deployment of AI. Using AI tools strategically to counter misinformation and hate speech online, but doing so in ways that are transparent, accountable, unbiased, and respect human autonomy and privacy. That's a huge challenge.
What about alternatives to potentially harmful belief systems?
Cultivating robust and accessible secular ethics and meaning frameworks. Providing ways for people to find purpose, belonging, community, and moral guidance outside of potentially dogmatic or exclusionary religious or ideological frameworks. Meeting those fundamental human needs in ways that are compatible with reason and pluralism.
And strengthening institutions.
Yes, strengthening democratic and pluralistic institutions, things like checks and balances, the rule of law, protection of minority rights, freedom of expression, robust platforms for public debate. These act as vital safeguards against ideological capture, extremism, and the oppression of dissenting views.
So the overall goal isn't some single unified worldview, but rather a world where different ways of finding meaning can coexist safely alongside reason and shared ethics.
Exactly. It represents a fundamental shift, perhaps, from the often fruitless debate of who is right about ultimate reality towards a more pragmatic, ethical, and psychologically informed inquiry. What fundamental human need is this particular belief or practice trying to satisfy, and how effectively and how ethically does it actually do so?
And this emerging science, potentially augmented by AI insights and definitely grounded in systemic thinking, is the key to navigating that shift.
It offers a powerful pathway, at least, a way to understand ourselves, our minds, our societies, our motivations with greater clarity and wisdom, hopefully enabling us to make more conscious, careful choices about the shared future we're building.
So pulling it all together, what does this all mean? This deep dive into the science of human belief really shows us that belief is, it's hardwired into us, isn't it? Shaped by evolution, culture, society, serving vital needs, but also carrying this immense potential for harm.
Yeah, and viewing it through that systemic lens really helps. It helps us see the complex web of factors involved, moving beyond simplistic judgments about why people believe what they believe or why they act on those beliefs.
And AI comes into the picture now as this new, incredibly powerful tool for analysis, but also as a complex force in its own right, one that requires really careful ethical navigation. It's not just studying, it's participating.
Right. And the whole journey, the point of this science, isn't about trying to eliminate belief that seems impossible and probably undesirable. It's about understanding it profoundly, its roots, its functions, its impacts. It's about maybe debugging, as the sources say, our collective systems and finding ways for all these diverse human quests for meaning to coexist, hopefully constructively, with reason and ethics.
Ultimately, then, this science challenges all of us, doesn't it? To look beyond just what people believe and try to understand why anyone believes anything at all and how we can collectively use that understanding to build a healthier, more balanced, maybe more resilient future.
Which really does raise a crucial question for everyone listening.
Yeah, here's an important question to mull over for yourself. Given how deeply intertwined beliefs are with our minds, our emotions, our communities, and recognizing how easily those beliefs can sometimes lead us away from purely rational or systemic thinking, what practical steps can you take starting today in your own life to better understand and navigate this complex world of belief, both your own beliefs and those of others?
This is DigitView.